Today, we're going to take a journey into the rich, complex, and often rebellious history of women in Urdu literature. It's a story all about how a voice, one that was silenced and spoken for so long, finally fought to speak for itself.
Let's start with something beautiful. This is one of the most famous verses in all of Urdu poetry, written way back in 1902 by the great poet Muhammad Iqbal. It's a child's prayer, a wish for a life that burns brightly, full of light and purpose. It really captures the soul of Urdu literature. But it also makes you wonder, right?
For a very, very long time, the answer to that was overwhelmingly men. That ambition, that prayer for an incandescent flame, those were ideals that were pretty much defined by and reserved for a male literary world. And that's really where our story kicks off.
You see, in the beginning, women in Urdu literature were subjects, not authors. They were characters in a world written by men, who got to decide their roles, their virtues, and, well, their supposed flaws. And as women started to want things like an education or a place in public life, this male-dominated literary world often reacted with, let's just say, a lot of anxiety and satire.
I mean, you can almost feel the panic in the humor here, can't you? This verse from the poet Akbar Allahabadi just perfectly captures this fear that educating women would flip the whole world on its head, completely upending the social order. The idea was that these educated women were a kind of disaster that would threaten masculinity itself.
And this fear, it was all rooted in keeping women confined to a very specific place, the zanana. Now, this wasn't just a physical part of the house, it was a social and psychological boundary. It was the world women were supposed to live in, separate from public life, from intellectual debates, and most certainly from creating their own literature.
And, even the so-called reformers of the time had a really limited vision. Sure, they argued for women's education, but not for the woman's own sake. The goal was purely practical and domestic, to make them better housekeepers, better companions for their husbands, and better mothers for their sons. The idea of a woman writing for her own self-expression, that just wasn't on the table.
But then, in the 1930s, a crack started to appear in this wall. A group of pretty radical thinkers, inspired by leftist ideas, got together and formed the Progressive Writers movement. And they were determined to drag literature kicking and screaming into the real world, tackling subjects that have been off-limits for way too long.
So the movement's opening shot was this collection of short stories called Angare, which means embers. And man, was it an explosion. It talked about sexuality, it criticized religious hypocrisy, it gave a voice to the oppressed. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Religious groups were outraged, and the government, wanting to keep them happy, banned the book just a year later. But it was too late. The spark had been lit.
And that brings us to one of the most courageous and honestly most important writers to come out of this whole movement, Ismat Chughtai. She took the progressives' ideas to their most controversial conclusion. She dared to write about the inner lives and the desires of women, but from a woman's point of view.
The story that made her both famous and infamous was called Lehaf, or The Quilt. It's told from the perspective of a young girl, and it hints at a lesbian relationship between a lonely wife and her maid, all hidden beneath the mysterious movements of a quilt. It never explicitly showed anything, but it suggested everything. The public reaction was just venomous. As Chughtai herself described it, she was bombarded with hate mail of the absolute worst kind. I mean, can you even imagine? Her personal life was torn apart, her family was attacked, and her marriage was strained to the breaking point. She had crossed a line that society wasn't even ready to admit existed.
And then, in 1944, it gets official. She was summoned to court in Lahore on charges of obscenity for writing a short story. The state itself was now trying to shut her up. And even though she eventually won the case, the trial itself was a massive turning point, not just for her, but for what women could dare to write about.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few decades to the 1980s in Pakistan during a military dictatorship. A new generation of women writers took up this mantle of defiance, but this time their main weapon was poetry, and their main target was the state.
Just listen to this. The poet Famida Riaz takes the chadar, a symbol of female piety that the state was pushing, and she basically throws it right back in their faces. She tells the authorities to use it to cover their own decaying morality, the corpse in your room. It's an act of just breathtaking defiance.
And then you have Kishwar Nahid, who is just as confrontational. In her poem, Punish Me, she's practically daring the people in power. She's framing her words as weapons, her children as a future rebellion.
She's not just speaking for herself, she's speaking for a future that's going to overthrow the current system.
So these poets were fighting on all fronts. Their poetry was a direct challenge to the military regime, to its use of religion to control people, and to the deep-seated misogyny that just wanted to keep women quiet. Their writing became this vital space for dissent when pretty much every other door was closed.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, you see this incredible, hard-fought evolution. It's a journey from women being these silent objects in men's stories to finally becoming the authors of their own reality, using their voices as tools of art, rebellion, and real power.
The path is pretty clear when you lay it out. It starts with women as subjects. Then comes that progressive spark that dared to talk about taboos. This led to a fierce struggle, with writers like Chugtai literally on trial. And finally, it all built up to this absolute roar of protest, as poets turned their art into a political weapon.
This quote from Kishwar Nahid just captures the beautiful, defiant paradox at the heart of this whole legacy. The very act of speaking becomes a rebellion in a place where listening, really listening to women's voices is forbidden. You have to speak because they don't want to hear you.
And that really leaves us with a final thought. This history shows us that a voice, once it finds the courage to speak, can't be easily put back in a box. It proves that a story, no matter how hard you try to suppress it, will eventually find a way to be told. The only question is, what happens next?